This is Mumia Abu-jamal to the IFJ. My fellow journalists and members of the International Federation of Journalists, I thank you for the work you do. I thank you for telling the stories of the people, of the oppressed and the repressed people all around the world. Your work has uncovered the excesses of the state as they dominate the people they claim to serve. Indeed, I write to you from one of the world's greatest sites of mass incarceration, the United States, generally, and in particular, the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania held more juvenile lifers than any jurisdiction on the planet Earth. And while that ebbed after the Miller case became law by the U.S. Supreme Court, just last summer, in June 2021, the Jones versus Mississippi case came out, reversing Miller. So Miller is no more. America, the prison house of nations, still. Struggles for freedom are happening across America, yes, but it happens in the shadow of repression. America, born in violence, seeded in violence.
This is a call from
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Mahanoy.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
Remains a nation wrapped in the coils of violence until, as we all have recently seen, even the babies aren't safe in small towns of America. Your work is valuable, for it is freedom work. I thank you all. Merci pour tout le monde. I thank you for doing what you do every day, being the voice of the people who are voiceless. This is your brother and comrade. In love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu-jamal.
This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek and Pacifica. And the struggle of journalists is very critical to have information about what's going on. And recently there was a World Press Freedom Day on May the 3rd around the world. And there were some actions in the United States around that day, around Julian Assange and also Mumia Abu-jamal, who was a journalist at public radio in Philadelphia and a member of the CWA NABIT, the union that I'm in, the CWA. And joining us today is Larry Goldbetter with Writers Union, National Writers Union, and also Edward Hasbrouck, who was involved in taking up a support for these two journalists at the UN. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having us on, Steve.
Good. So, Larry, why don't you talk about your union's position and why you brought together both the case of Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal?
First, let me say that, we're an affiliate union of the International Federation of Journalists, which represents 150 unions in about 140 countries and represents 600,000 journalists around the world. And at our World Congress last year and at previous meetings, the IFJ is firmly in support of Mumia and Assange to free them both. And at the IFJ Congress last June, in June of 2022, we started to make plans to make a visit to Mumia in Pennsylvania. And we're trying to mount a campaign in the US for our union and other journalist unions to come out and send a statement to the Department of Justice demanding that the charges against Assange be dropped.
And most people don't know about Mumia as a journalist, although he writes columns. He had a program not just on public radio in Philadelphia, but also contributions on NPR. But he's been a journalist, and that is probably one of the reasons he was targeted by the Philadelphia police for his reports on what was going on with police activity in Philadelphia. You think that has something to do with this?
Yeah, exactly. Not, he was a rising star in the journalism field when he was arrested, and he was well known and politically active, a member of the Black Panther Party, and you know, he was a journalist. That's what he was, and an activist, and he still is. And just in terms of his writing, he now has a column in our union's newsletter. The first one was last one. We have another one coming out in June, and we'll be making another visit to see him.
Really important, I think, to understand that journalism about prisons, like journalism about other, impacted and oppressed communities, isn't just about people parachuting in from outside and writing about them. Journalism about prisons comes from insiders, and Mumia's work over the last 40 years as a prisoner, writing books, recording despite tremendous obstacles, audio commentaries, has been really important and has been part of a broader movement of prisoners documenting as journalists their own experience in the prisons that parallels experiences around the world, where reporting about the global South isn't just coming from US or European reporters who parachute in, but more and more of that journalism is coming from within those communities. And that's a really good thing. And I think that's been an important focus and emphasis and shift for IFJ as an international federation, is to recognize the importance of reporting from within the global South and from oppressed communities in the global North.
And Larry, you visited Mumia with a delegation of journalists?
Yes, a small group of us on March 9th, had a 3-hour visit with Mumia. Myself representing IFJ and NWU, Patrick Kamenka from the French National Union of Journalists, and blocking his name, Jackie Hartout of the French Collective for the Liberation of Mumia, Lebron Mumia. And in France, this has been quite a campaign. When Mumia was on death row, which was 30 years of the 40-something he's been in prison, there were weekly demonstrations in Paris to free him. And since he was taken out of death row, they've gone to monthly meetings, but it's still a very live issue. So we were fortunate enough to spend 3 hours with him. He's healthy. He's overcome a number of health issues. He had COVID in prison. He had heart issues in prison. But he said he lost a lot of weight. He's working out 3 days a week, and he's very sharp, and intellectually, that's what keeps him going. So he's getting into a PhD program, and he's beginning to write a book, an anthology of writing from formerly enslaved and formerly incarcerated writers.
And it seems that there's a struggle in this country for people to understand the importance of the defense of journalists like Mumia, and also the case of Julian Assange, who is another journalist who's in security prison in Britain. They have really faced the wrath of the state for exposing, in the case of Mumia, the crimes of Philadelphia police, and in the case of Julian Assange, the crimes of the US government in Iraq.
Exactly.
And it seems like this is a danger, a growing danger for not just them, but for all journalists, as far as the use of laws like the espionage law against somebody who's not even a citizen of the United States.
Being held in a third country.
It's a world law. Edward?
Yeah, this was a theme that we heard on World Press Freedom Day, where I was in New York in the UN General Assembly chambers at an all-day symposium that was held with speakers from around the world, from a variety of organizations, non-governmental organizations, journalism organizations, human rights defenders.
We have time for one question. There's a roving mic coming to you. The gentleman on the left is the one I saw first. Can I ask you to be very brief, because we have 3 minutes and 39 seconds before we need to leave the stage? Thank you.
Yes, I represent the International Federation of Journalists and the National Writers Union, one of its affiliates here in the United States. And since we're naming names, I want to call the attention of this body to Julian Assange, who the U.S. is attempting to criminalize for publishing truthful information about U.S. war crimes. And the case of Mumia Abu-jamal, a journalist and member of our organization who has been imprisoned for decades in the United States. And my question is, since you are speaking of accountability, while it's easy to speak of accountability for individual actors or to criticize small states in the global south, what are the means of accountability that can hold accountable the governments of a great power such as the United States and the global north when its government attempts to criminalize journalism?
Thank you. Ilse Mumia, who wants to take this?
I do not think in our work we should be allowed to treat states differently when it comes to the accountability. So your question is extremely relevant, and it's not just a question. It's something that I personally try to do in my work related to all human rights violations, not only in relation to freedom of expression. And when it comes to Assange, there was no difference in dealing with the United Kingdom. I wrote a letter that is public to then, at that time, Home Secretary Priti Patel, asking United Kingdom not to extradite Julian Assange, which is something that is part of the work and the mandate I have. Of course, we cannot reach out to the rest of the world, but my office was not the only one that raised this issue. It was also the OSCE Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media. So I wouldn't say, that international organizations are shying away to point the finger also, as you said, to the big powers and the strong ones, and not only to the ones that are not powerful politically. But there are also small states, sometimes not really very relevant in the political setting, that are actually also doing, very dangerous things when it comes to free expression and journalism. So we should really, treat all equally, regardless of, the importance of a certain state, because you cannot talk about press freedom and importance of safety of journalists in other parts of the world if you are not really making sure that in your particular country there is everything that has been done in order to make sure that there is a clear, importance and recognition of press freedom. So just pointing fingers to others is also not going to solve any of the problems. It is important, of course, but you cannot really say, let's help the ones that have problems in Iran, in Turkey, in Russia, and at the same time, neglect problems related to free speech in your own countries.
And one of the themes was that increasingly repressive governments aren't overtly prosecuting people for practicing journalism, but they're trumping up other kinds of charges, using other pretexts that sound to a naive audience more legitimate and more defensible than overtly saying, well, we're going to lock this guy up because we don't like what they said. There are these other kinds of pretextual offenses, and that's so. What is happening with Assange and Mumia and the kinds of charges that are being brought against them are very much mirroring a global pattern, despite the fact that the U.S. wants to present itself, of course, as being better than the rest of the world on human rights. And we all know that that isn't true and need to punch through that wherever we get a chance.
And the number of journalists that have been imprisoned, been targeted, tortured, murdered is growing The war in Iraq, I remember the United States military blew up a news agency on a building, and they said they didn't know that it was a location of
Right.
journalists.
Right. And in Ukraine, the journalists have been targeted. In Palestine, the Israelis have targeted media centers and journalists, and of course the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, and one of many.
Isn't it illegal under international law to target journalists and murder journalists?
Well, actually, one of the calls, we were distributing at the UN the statement produced for World Press Freedom Day by the International Federation of Journalists, and its central call is that there needs to be a new international instrument, a new treaty specifically to protect journalists and to mandate that governments investigate and prosecute those who attack journalists. So yes, broadly speaking, attacks on journalists are going to be attacks that violate existing human rights law, existing principles, but there is a need for greater clarity, and that's a central call of the International Federation of Journalists to beef up the international legal regime.
And also, I mean, the action against journalists, I know there was a woman reporter at Associated Press who was targeted by supporters of Israel, and they looked at her Facebook page and felt she was critical of Israel, and then she was fired from her position. It seems like that this is a growing danger for journalists, and to try to intimidate journalists not to talk about stories that are controversial.
I think that's true. And to bring this back to the question of labor rights and labor organizing, part of the problem is that more and more journalism is being outsourced to stringers and freelancers rather than to staff writers. The NWU represents freelancers primarily, in contrast to the Newspaper Guild and SAG-AFTRA, which represent more the staff writers in print and broadcast journalism, respectively. But it's one thing if you're a staff writer and you are targeted. We heard at World Press Freedom Day, again in New York, about the situation of Evan Gershowitz, the New York Times reporter who's been accused of espionage in Russia. But in his case, we had, Arthur Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times, being given the podium at the UN to talk about all the things that the New York Times is doing to try and help out their staff employee, which is all great, except that more and more, even war reporting is being outsourced. And if you're a stringer, you're a freelancer, you don't have the army of lawyers and support and the publicity machine of the New York Times or an organization like that backing you up. So there are real issues as far as safety and security and insurance and support when things go south for freelancers that are really key to a freelancers union like the NWU.
And what kind of support did you find at the United Nations when you went there for these cases, Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal?
Well, the program was very stage managed. I think they took 3 questions from the floor during the entire day. So it was, sort of non-controversial, people all making the right noises. And when, halfway through the day, when they, for the first time, turned to the audience, and I was able to get my hand up and be recognized, and I spoke up in support of Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal. And it got spontaneous applause from the room. The people who were actually there really strongly endorsed having these issues raised. Now, the people from the US State Department who were monitoring the proceedings and reporting back obviously didn't want to have to report to their bosses that they couldn't try to talk about journalist rights and oppression of journalists and just focus it elsewhere, that if they were going to have that discussion in the US, people were, whether they liked it or not, going to raise these cases like Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal. But I would say the response was overwhelmingly positive from the people in the room, and even those who were on the panel, which was a group of human rights defenders, people from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the various human rights mandates within the UN system, for the most part, those entities have a power to name and shame, but very little power of enforcement, particularly over the US, which has been loath to accept international jurisdiction or recognize international treaties for anything it does. But what was interesting was that even though those people on the panel had not, until I raised it, brought up these US cases, once they were prompted, the really important thing was that they were clear that these were cases of journalists. Again, notwithstanding the effort that the US has made with Julian Assange in particular to try to say, oh, he's not a journalist. I don't think there was anybody in that room, either in the audience or the panel, who questioned in any way that we were talking about a journalist. And I think that that recognition is really important, just as recognition that Mumia Abu-jamal is a journalist and is entitled to keep practicing journalism, even if he's in prison, has been very important and remains so.
Well, Julian Assange was a member of the Journalists Union in Australia, which has taken up his case and supported him, the International Federation of Journalists. And Mumia Abu-jamal was a member of the CWA NABIT at public radio in Philadelphia. Yet it seems like the News Guild and also the AFL-CIO don't take up the issue and haven't taken up the issue. It seems to be there's a political problem. I do know they've taken up the issue of the Wall Street journalist who was incarcerated by the Russians, but as far as journalists that we are incarcerating, it seems to be another issue.
Totally.
I
mean, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think, we're here on behalf of the National Writers Union, on behalf of the International Federation of Journalists. I don't think there is any organization that represents the collective voice of journalists worldwide better than IFJ, and they've been clear and unambiguous for years. I mean, it's not every day that an international organization sends a delegation to come to the US to actually go into the prisons, to call out somebody who's being railroaded by the US government. That's really, I think, a very strong statement. This isn't just, making noises from afar, but really trying to show solidarity across borders. I only hope that we can show as much solidarity for the people elsewhere who are getting the same treatment that the internationalist community has been able to show for people in the US who are suffering this kind of treatment.
Larry?
Yeah, I think, we're trying to, well, let me say, about a year ago, I guess by now, the Times and Le Monde and the Spiegel and
Washington Post,
El País, they put out a joint statement about Assange, calling for his release and for the government to drop the charges. The unions have not responded like that. And on our part, we've been trying to organize that kind of a response to get the major journalist unions in the US to sign a joint letter to the Biden administration, to the Department of Justice, saying drop the charges. We think that would really go a long way. And even if it didn't help that much legally in the legal case, it would help tremendously in terms of US unions taking a stand about somebody who exposed US war crimes, where every journalist union in the world has taken this position except the US. And so, I mean, if we don't take that stand, then we're covering for those war crimes, in my opinion, and totally on the wrong side of the issue and of history. And so I think it's an important fight, and we're going to continue to make it until we get, we can get that kind of a statement to the DOJ.
And the issue of the danger of world war, the Ukraine war, and now G7 is going on in Japan. People are being deported. There's a lot of intimidation of journalists in Japan by the government of Japan. It seems like the growing war hysteria is even a further threat to journalists who want to take a critical analysis of what's going on with militarization and the military-industrial complex, which makes a lot of money off of war in the United States.
I think it's kind of a universal trend right now about attacking the media, and it's not just the major powers that are, shaping imperialist war, but, in Just this week, a journalist in Tunisia was sentenced to 5 years in prison just days ago, either yesterday or the day before. 5 years in prison for opposing the government or exposing a government policy in Sudan. The union has been, their office was seized. Most of their members are in exile. The president's been in exile since 2019. And in Russia, you know, I would say half of the Russian journalists are in exile right now, the ones that are working. It's, you know, so I mean, it's like a universal trend to, as the world gets closer and closer to war, to, they say the first casualty of war is the truth. And journalists are embodying that saying right now.
And you're going to go on a delegation to Israel and Palestine?
The Palestinian Journalist Syndicate is having their Congress next week, and they've invited a number of the IFJ union's executive committee members. I was fortunate enough to get an invitation, so I'll be going, and there'll probably be about 15 of us there from around the world to take part in that conference. And I don't know if there was an article in these Times just this week that I sent around to our members that this is the bloodiest year in the West Bank in over 2 decades. It's not just the U.S. attacking Gaza, but also in the West Bank as well. Well, hopefully the Congress is going to happen, and we'll be able to get to it.
Okay, well, maybe we can get a report from you when you get there. And also, maybe if they videotape the conference, we could have the statements of people who speak at the Congress, so people around the world and in the United States could get a direct hearing.
I will pass on that invitation.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us. And hopefully the CWA and the News Guild are having a convention in July. Maybe we can get a petition there, at least to the News Guild members, to support the cases of Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal. So thanks for joining us today.
All right, thank you.